And now for our final time period, the late empire. And you know, you got a joke, nothing ever good happens late, right? So nothing really good's gonna happen here either. But there are some interesting emperors to talk about here. But the first thing we should do is get into like what makes this decline of Rome happen. I always cite really three main reasons that Rome begins to fall or Rome begins to decline. Number one, to me, is the fact that the empire has gotten just way too big. If you think about trying to control an area the size of Rome, it really becomes out of their control. When I'm in my classroom can seat about 60 people. So back in the day when I taught like real big classes, don't do that anymore. But now that I do 5 smaller ones, I used to do like 3 larger ones. Sometimes I'd have 60 people in the class. And what I would say to them is, think about the fact of if everybody started doing something crazy right now with 60 people, like I can't control any of that. Like that's going to go completely sideways. This is why if you're in like a lecture hall with like 300 people, like over at FSU or FAMU, they usually have a lot of TAs proling and patrolling because, there's no way the professor can answer questions from like 300 people. So that's always kind of the visual I try to use with my students. So try to imagine a classroom with like a lot of people in it, and then, you can't control that. So what starts to happen is the empire kind of starts to break into two. It starts to split into Eastern and Western segments. And we'll get more into that when we get into the Byzantine Empire discussion. But it becomes impossible in a sense for Rome to really govern itself properly. And that is going to lead to political problems. It's going to lead to problems for the regular people on the ground. So the largeness of the Roman Empire is the first thing I always cite and, say there will be this splitting apart that starts to happen as Rome starts to fall. The second thing, which is I think linked to the first thing, is that inflation starts to go up. Money is not buying what it should, right? You can't barter for the same amount of goods. It becomes really problematic for people to live their lives. And I'd mentioned to you bread and circus, right? If it's hard for people to get food, they get really cranky, Food is the first thing we need. If that's not secured for you, all else follows, it's just, it gets bad. So the fact that people are not being able to be fed easily, there's famine that starts to break out in some of the grain producing regions, and it just gets bad. And then the third reason, and I think this reason has a lot of impact as well, maybe the most, is the rise of Christianity within Rome. Christianity had always been sort of an underground religion from the early days of the Roman Empire, and it was there, but mainly it was ignored or persecuted. So if you go back and think about Nero was famous for persecuting Christians. He used them as living torches in his gardens. If you look at the Colosseum, the gladiators were often fighting Christian prisoners and killing them. So Christians were around, but they were usually persecuted. They were not favored. Towards the end of the Roman time period, you start to see a lot more power come to Christians, right? You start to see their ranks getting larger and it becoming something that can't be ignored in a sense. And so to me, it completely changes the whole outlook of how Romans will do things. Because think about it, I've said that the Romans are kind of a surface people. If it looks pretty, it looks good, right? It's easy, it's efficient. That's kind of what Romans favored. Christianity is not about any of those things. It's about serious commitment to a faith system in a way that's very earnest and truthful. So I think the collision of the Christian belief system up against the Roman paganism, it was a sharp contrast. And it definitely did a lot to change the attitude, right, of the Romans here at the end of the empire. And I bring this up because we're going to talk about Constantine, who is viewed as the first Christian emperor of Rome, who, by his decree, changes everything, right? Not just for his people, but for Western history. So it's important to consider the role of Christianity, I think, as we move into this discussion. Now, who are these emperors, right, during the late empire? To me, they are people who are trying to scramble and scrabble around to keep control, because they understood how volatile the people they were ruling were becoming. They knew that they were becoming dangerous, that they couldn't trust them. A lot of emperors were getting assassinated all the time. If you look at the imperial roles during the late empire, there were people that ruled for like a day before they got assassinated. So why am I saying this? I'm saying this because I think you had to be a harder sort to be a late empire ruler. Augustus's peace and prosperity, I don't think you could sell that the same way here, right? So, Caracalla. This guy looks like a badass, right? I mean, he looks grouchy and grumpy. Because I think he understood very strongly that he had to have power and control and might. And, you know, there's that famous Machiavellian saying, is it better to be feared or to be loved? And I think I said before, it's better to be feared if you want to actually rule people. Being loved makes people, you know, think they can take advantage of you. So if they fear you, they're generally like, I'm not asking, right? I'm scared of them, right? So Caracalla to me is definitely a fear guy. And this even goes to how he gains power. He's from the family of Septimius Severus, who was an emperor who actually was from Africa. So you'll notice if you look at this portrait, Septimius Severus looks African, he looks darker skinned. And then his wife was a Mediterranean patrician woman. So we talked a lot about, you know, these patricians marrying in a certain way to make allegiances or make alliances. Septimius Severus had been a military official. That's how he kind of came to being an emperor. He and his wife had 2 children, Caracalla, of course, and then Geta. Well, you'll notice one of them isn't there anymore. This is how brutal Caracalla was. He and his own mother basically plotted against Geta so Caracalla could have the full imperial rulership. Because Septimius Severus was kind of like, well, maybe they can be co-emperors. You know, maybe that could work. And Caracalla's like, nope, gonna kill him. So that's the brutality, I think, of a late empire ruler, is that attitude of like, get out of my way. I don't need you here, you know. If you're wondering where his image went, Caracalla actually made it a crime to speak Geta's name. His imagery was erased from all imperial portraiture. Any kind of reference point to him was taken out. And it was punishable by death, right, to speak Geta's name. So, yeah, it's pretty serious consequences. So to me, when I think of a lot of these late empire rulers, I'm like, they were like, I have to be hard first. I have to make sure that I'm showing you a hardness, right, so that I don't get attacked, right? I have to make sure you're scared of me first. And that's, to me, Caracalla's way. There's then also the Diocletian way. Diocletian, he comes up with this idea of ruling almost by committee, which I told you before usually doesn't work too well either. So Diocletian, he comes up with a system that he calls the tetrarchs. Tetrarchies are fours, right? It's a rule of 4. So you'll notice in the sculpture you have 2 individuals kind of hugging each other and then 2 on the backside kind of hugging each other. He understood very strongly that the West and the East were starting to separate. The Roman Empire was starting to split apart. So how does he deal with this? He deals with it by saying, okay, there should be teams of 2, one in the West and one in the East. An Augustus and his Caesar. So notice he goes back to like early empire language, trying to be like, remember the good old days? Remember when things weren't shitty? Right? Yeah. So he says an Augustus and Caesar of the West, an Augustus and a Caesar of the East, right? In that rule of 4, make sure that all parts of the empire are protected, all parts of the empire are overseen, and that's going to be more efficient way to rule. Now this sounds great on paper, doesn't it? But if you look at the statue, all I see is fear. They're like, hold me, you know, I'm afraid. I'm not getting a lot of strength off of this. I'm getting more, these were people that feared for their life. You know, they knew they could be assassinated any time. So I think, you know, what the purpose was and then how it reads as a statue, it really shows you how much, you know, turmoil and unsurety really flourished in the late empire. So yeah. The other thing I want to mention is the material. It's called porphyry. It's a type of stone. And it has this kind of purplish, reddish kind of color. It's a very rare stone. Supposedly today there's not any porphyry anymore to even carve. It's all been carved. There's no more left. So it's a very rare stone. It's got this kind of purplish color. And I wanted to point it out because it's unusual, but also the color purple was something that Roman emperors used to suggest their power. And we'll talk more about the color purple when we get into our discussion of the Byzantine, which is basically just the Roman Empire part 2, right? So again, keep the color purple as an imperial color in mind, especially as we get into the Byzantine conversation a little bit further on. Also wanted to mention the style of the statue. Because during the Greco-Roman time, right, starting with the Greeks, you have this progression through naturalism that the Greeks achieve. And then the Romans obviously are using the inspiration of the Greeks to create their statuary too, their art. Here you might go, what the heck happened? Looks really stylized again. You would not be incorrect. And I want you to be thinking about this because as the Roman Empire starts to fall, what we think happened was there wasn't as many artists being trained properly. It just wasn't a priority. And you see that realism being lost again and stylization emerging once more. So by the time we get to the medieval period, you have very, very stylized art. Naturalism is nowhere to be seen. It won't be seen again until the Renaissance, which is the revival, of course, the rebirth. So again, just being able to look at the statue and think about the composition, how it's created, gives you a glimpse of, the problems that are facing people here in the late empire as it's starting to dissolve. The final thing to speak about in the late empire, one of my favorite historical figures to discuss, is the Emperor Constantine. As I mentioned, Emperor Constantine is the first Roman emperor who is a Christian and brings Christianity to the Roman people. So he's the force behind Christianization, we'd say, of Rome that will continue into when the Romans become the Byzantine Empire. So he's very, very important in that way. There's an author I really love. I always recommend him to my students, Thomas Cahill. Great author. Why I like him so much is he writes these very accessible discussions of turning points in history. And he calls the book series that he does the hinges of history. Like he believes in the idea of a hinge, almost like a door opening and closing. And so for him, Constantine is a hinge in history. He opens the door to monotheism, and he closes the door on polytheism. So all throughout this course, when we've been talking about religion, we've been talking about polytheism. Now we're going to start talking about monotheism, and we're not going to stop. So Constantine is this hinge, this door in history. Because of that, he's very important. So again, if you're a fan of Western history, you should know Constantine. If you're a fan of Christian history, you should know Constantine. He's very fundamental to the foundation of Christianity having the hold that it does in the Western world. It's all because of Constantine at the end of the day. And the reason why he did it, people can debate, but I think a lot of it was political. What I think happened was he understood very much that many, many Romans were now Christian, even if they were hiding it, even if they weren't speaking about it openly. It's noted that his own sister and mother were Christians, so he had family members that were Christian. And so at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge against his rival Maxentius, he basically is said to have said to his soldiers, follow me under the mantle of Christ, and if I win and become your emperor, I will make Christianity a lawful religion. It's said that he saw a vision in the sky of a floating cross. As you're looking at the painting here, so this is a later Renaissance painting, but you get the point. You can see kind of a cross, held up by putti, kind of at the top of the frame. But he said that he says to his soldiers, I see this cross, will you fight with me, under the mantle of Christ? Supposedly they put crosses on their shields, right? And they went off into battle with this promise of, if you back me, I'll help you. I'll let you not be persecuted anymore. I'll let you be open Christians. I will make you not have to hide to practice your religion. So the people fight for him under this idea that, they're gaining something. And he is good on his promise. He beats Maxentius, and he issues the Edict of Milan, and then followed by the Council of Nicaea decision in 325. The Edict of Milan makes Christianity a lawful religion. It makes it something that they can practice in public. Before this, Christians were persecuted, as I mentioned before. And then the Council of Nicaea basically made Christianity the only Roman religion. So that's something we'll talk about when we talk about early Christianity as our next big topic, our next set of lectures, because before this, to be pagan was to be privileged, and basically this reverses that decision and lets Christianity be on top. So it completely changed the whole social structure of Rome you can't get away from, how big a fundamental change, right, that would have been. So people argue about, why did he do this? Was it really because he was very devout? Was he trying to protect his family? Was it a political move? To me, it could have been all three. But I think he was a savvy politician, and I think that he understood that if people were already overwhelmingly Christian but not really being open about it, he was being the smart one. That he could ride that wave, or he could try to ignore it. It was smarter for him to try to go with public opinion rather than go against it. So if you really love studying Christianity, its roots, its foundation, you can't not study Constantine. He's kind of your guy. He needs to be understood. I've never seen it, but there's a documentary like Constantine's Sword. It talks about how, using Christianity kind of as a political weapon. And there's other, again, books about Constantine. Again, Thomas Cahill's great on Constantine as well. Constantine's signature monument is the Arch of Constantine. Now, this is the only arch we're looking at for our purposes because of our time constraints. But the triumphal arch, as we call it, was a very typical type of monument that was created throughout the Roman Empire. The Arch of Titus is another famous one you can go look at. And they called these triumphal arches. They were these freestanding monuments meant to celebrate a victory or celebrate an emperor. So, again, it's a signature monument. Notice it's right by the Colosseum, if you're looking off in the background. But what's really interesting with Constantine making this arch was that he had already left Rome at this time. So when we study the Roman Empire changing into the Byzantine Empire, we'll study the city of Constantinople, where basically Constantine had left and gone to. Constantine understood Christianity was rising, and he also understood that Rome was falling. So he actually took his people, his closest advisors, and he actually left and went to Byzantium, which he then renamed Constantinople. We'll get more into this, right, as we look at early Christianity and Byzantine. So I'll show you some maps and we'll talk about geographic location. But what I always love about the Arch of Constantine is, to me, it's like a monument that he leaves behind in Rome because he knows he has to, all the while abandoning it at the same time. So he's like, I know I have to leave you a monument, so here you go. But I'm leaving, bye. And his heart doesn't even really seem in it because most of the sculpture on the monument is actually stolen from other monuments. And again, I'm not going to go through and show you where everything's from, but Hadrian, for instance, is one of the people he stole some sculpture from. We call it the spolia because it's the spoils of war, essentially, or the spoils of a monument. But the two rondelles, or the two round sections, are stolen from Hadrian's monument, and then the small strip below that is part of the only original sculpture on the piece, and we'll talk about that a little further on in a minute. But I always say, Constantine, his heart just wasn't in it. He was like, I'll steal some stuff, kind of put it here on my monument, kind of a shout out to all the great emperors, and I'm going to leave, bye, see you later. So it's interesting to consider that he's not really wed to Rome anymore. He changes the religion, he changes the geography, geographical location of the capital. He's just like out. He's like, no. But again, he's a smart man. He understands when something's rotting from the inside and you may not be able to save it, best to just walk away sometimes, sometimes there's nothing to be done. So he just takes off. Notice with Hadrian's sculpture, it's much more advanced. And then if you look at the sculpture related to Constantine's time, as I mentioned, there was that sense of losing realism and naturalism and descending more into stylization again. I'm sure you can see that quite prominently here. Now, as Romans, as I mentioned, we're going to next go on and talk a bit about just early Christian art and the consequences of early Christian art. And then we'll also look at Byzantium, right? We'll talk about how the Roman Empire moves to Constantinople, and we start to call it the Byzantine Empire. They're still Romans, they're just kind of Romans part two. But again, that will be the two conversations coming up that we're going to be having as we leave the late empire here. So bye-bye Romans, right? Sorry to see you decline so badly, right? But that's the way sometimes the cookie crumbles.